Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. This is a platform where we get curious about all things gender, sex and sexuality, as well as feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. Come with us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I identify as a cisgender woman and my pronouns are she and her. In this episode, I'm speaking to Charlie, a theatre composer, lyricist and LGBT+ and political activist. Charlie's pronouns are he, him, and he identifies as a gay trans man. Find out what that means to Charlie in this episode. We also talk about gender identity and expression versus sexual orientation, gender roles, transitioning, dysphoria, gender identity clinic waiting lists, trans visibility and activism, and how there is no such thing as a universal trans experience. It was recorded on the 10th of September 2020. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Hi, I'm Charlie, and my pronouns are he, him.
And how do you identify, Charlie?
I identify as a man, I'm a trans man, and a gay trans man. So I made that identifier steadily longer each time.
Right. Tell us a little bit about your journey. Would you consider yourself, first of all, would you consider yourself having had a binary transition?
Yes, it is something I relate to. I mean, my thoughts around kind of gender as a construct is that it isn't binary. But in terms of how I kind of related that to myself, I always identified very much as a man, or, as a boy from when I was a child. And once I transitioned, that felt like I was complete, I suppose. I mean,
Mm.
obviously, again, like I said, I kind of think the gender binary is a bit of a lie. And in terms of if, we talk about gender in different ways. There's your internal identity, there's expression. And in terms of gender expression, mine definitely doesn't fit into a typical just binary masculine. There are things that I think are
Mm.
very feminine about me that I absolutely embrace.
Mm.
But in terms of that internal identity, I quite easily fit inside that binary, yeah.
Okay. You said you have felt like a boy since you're a very young kid. How did that affect, your life growing up? Did you get support in that, or were you just for a while, was it internal and were you just plain confused?
Well, when I was very young, it's kind I mean, it's a kind of weird thing to explain because, of course,
Yeah.
as a very young child, and I'm thinking about from my sort of earliest. I mean, if you say to me, "When did you have these feelings?" It's kind of my earliest conscious memory, really, and it's like but you don't have the language for it.
Mm.
Now, in that early stage of childhood, I was very fortunate in a lot of ways in that I grew up in a family that thought like me, that kind of like these ideas of gender and what a boy should be and what a girl should be were pretty rubbish. So
Mm.
when it came to my tastes and my likes, and how I wanted to dress and how I wanted to present myself and the hobbies I wanted to take up, it didn't matter. There was no such thing as things that boys were allowed to do and things that girls were allowed to do. But I don't think, obviously, my family, the people around me, understood that actually that was an internal conflict of identity. It was just, as far as they would see, they would have said that I was a tomboy,
Mhm.
and that was absolutely fine. But I suppose it wasn't until later that, and of course, at that young age, again, like I said, you don't really have the language to express it. Although I think I did in some ways, and I certainly know that I remember when I was a kid, I would get very, very angry if I was out somewhere and, I did present as a boy. And so people who didn't know me assumed they were seeing a boy. And
Mm.
if my parents or friends corrected them using those inverted commas, I would get annoyed at this and I wouldn't understand why, and I would want them not to correct this.
Mm.
Um, I think had I grown up today with everything being so much more visible, I think probably the people in my life would have thought, maybe Charlie could be trans, but
Yeah.
it wasn't really something that was thought about then.
Mm.
Certainly not in terms of young kids. It was sensationalized. I remember seeing things. There was a documentary called The Sex Change on TV when I was a kid. And that was something that, it was like, in terms of how the world saw it, well, it was this middle aged man that decided they wanted to be a woman. That was
Mm.
kind of the kind of thought process about what trans was then. But yeah, so like I say, so that childhood memory in some ways was quite happy in terms of gender because I was allowed to present the way that I wanted, and I wasn't forced to do things that I didn't want. It's really for me, I suppose, that teenage years and the onset of puberty was the real internal struggle. And I have had this conversation with other trans people, and it's certainly not a universal concept, but something I've found that other trans people have said to me is that, and that I have myself, is that my teenage years I find very difficult to talk about, not just because it is trauma, and because you're going back and you're revisiting trauma. I can kind of do that now, I think, from a little bit of a distance, but actually because there's very little memory of it there. And I
Mm.
think that trauma, that has been my way, my psyche's way of dealing with that trauma of what I went through as a teenager, has been to sort of disassociate from it. So it's almost like it didn't happen to me, it happened to someone else. And I can't remember that much of it. And I've
Right.
certainly had conversations with other trans people who have said that they experience similar.
Ah, interesting. And when you say you don't remember much of it, well, when you talk about trauma, do you mean is that related to the changes in yourself or like the way the outside world responded to you, or maybe a combination of both?
It's a combination of both, I think, but for me, it was very much the physical. So it was. So the way I always explain my gender and gender expression is I say, as when I grew up, I wanted short hair because boys had short hair, and I wanted to present as a boy, and I wanted to wear trousers because boys wore trousers, and I wanted to present as a boy.
Hmm.
And if I had grown up in a society where boys were expected to, have long hair and wear skirts, that would have been what I wanted to do because
Hmm.
it's that gender performativity, you know.
Yeah.
So that was what I wanted to present to the world. And yes, it did hurt socially that the boys were changing in ways that I felt I should, and therefore those changes weren't presenting to the world. But for me, it was very much more an internal physical thing. That was really the difficult pain. My body was changing in this way that it wasn't supposed to change.
Hmm.
And to this day, I still don't understand why that causes so much trauma, but it did. And that was the major cause.
Mm. And was there also an element of you mentioned you're a gay man, and were you maybe also confused about that at first, like because you felt attracted to men, but there was also your identity. Did you find them in any way like conflicting or interlinked at one point, or did you think what is the difference, or is there even a difference there?
The short answer is probably no, actually. Um, I grew up around the theatre, and I suppose it's a bit of a cliche, but therefore I grew up around quite a lot of gay men.
Right.
And so that to me was something that was fairly normal. And it was interesting, sort of at that age of about, I suppose, 11 or 12, I could very much see that I identified very much with these men. And, that was so I kind of I was someone that I think kind of always really knew their identity was that as a man. I didn't really have that much internal conflict over it. There were some times, but really, actually, I kind of knew and accepted that. One of
Mm.
the things I find interesting is from talking to some other friends of mine who are trans and who aren't gay, who are heterosexual. They have said that, funnily enough, their sexuality, and again, obviously, the trans experience isn't universal,
Hmm.
but that for some of them, they have found that their sexuality was the thing that kind of caused more of that internal feeling of not necessarily conflict, but I have heard various straight trans men say, you know, I grew up, I came out as a lesbian, and I just assumed that this is what it felt like to be gay, you know.
Right.
And so they were taught that, well, essentially because of their sexuality, they were the other, and that was what the other taught them. Now, although I kind of knew my internal sexuality as a gay man, to the world, that would be, in inverted commas again, the norm, you know.
Mm.
So were I really a heterosexual woman, I wouldn't be having these conflicts around sexuality and gender. So actually, in some ways, I think having that sexuality was more helpful to accepting that my gender identity than it was a hindrance. And it was certainly something I
Wow.
really embraced.
Mm. Oh, that's interesting. So, at what age did you start your actual transition? Were you like, okay, this needs to happen now?
I was 18, and it was pretty much as soon as I could, really. I wasn't aware. I don't, in fact, I still don't think child services were that great when I was a kid. I mean, they're not that great now, but they're certainly better. But I'd already, from the age of about 15, been in contact with and then going to mermaids meetings. And as a sort of slightly older teenager, I was able to do that myself. I did actually come out to my parents when I was in my teen years. You'll remember, or recall, I said earlier that my teen years are a bit of a blank. So even things like putting an age on something can be very difficult for me. But I think I was probably around 14, 15. So I think it was the same age I was starting to find out about things like mermaids. And I think, funnily enough, so for me, this was in the late 90s. So it was when the home internet was just really coming into being a kind of like big thing. And for me, that was a huge way I was able to explore and go, yeah, this is who I am, and this is what I can do, and these are the people I can get in contact with. Now, my parents were very, very supportive in the long run. To begin with, my dad, who I loved and adored, and in the end was very supportive. And I say in the end, it didn't even take huge amounts of time. But when I came out at 14, wasn't really that supportive. And it's interesting because I think it plays back into what I was saying about my childhood being one where they didn't believe in gender roles. They didn't, but like, yeah, girls can do this, boys can do that. It doesn't matter. And so, therefore, when it actually came to me coming out as trans and saying, well, actually, I am a boy, my dad's reaction was, well, you don't need to stick yourself in this box. You can be whatever. You don't have to be a boy to be this, this, and this. So, funnily
Mm.
enough, that progressiveness was actually the thing that held him back. And that kind of put me not, back in the closet, I suppose, for a few years. I came out to my best friend whilst I was still at school, but that was about it. And then, yeah, when I was 18, I tried to go away to college. And that was when I knew, well, I just have to change. I just have to get this done now. And at that point, my parents were really supportive. And I think, particularly, once I had started hormones and they could see this change in me as I was coming into being myself, my dad then apologized to me, because he could see that I was happy and that was what mattered.
Mm. Wow, that's really great that they came around, and very interesting about what you're saying about, why do you have to do this? You can be whoever you want anyway. Why do you have to change anything, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
And of course, I didn't know the answer to that question. and
Right.
and so, I think nowadays if someone said that to me, I could come up with all these answers about why I felt the way I did. Although I still, you know, it's like saying, why are you gay? I
Right.
am because I am, and I know, and that's it, and that should be enough.
Mm,
So I couldn't, that's specifically the answer. But of course, when I was 14, I didn't have the confidence to be able to go, I know all that, and I
hmm.
accept all that, but that
Yeah.
still doesn't change it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Amazing. So how long did your transition take? And you feel like you very much you're done with that? Do you feel like you've arrived there when it comes to your gender and identity?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to talk about surgery too much because I
That's fine.
feel like it's not just about my journey, it's about other people's journeys, I think. And I think
Of
this can
course.
the kind of focus on surgery can make other people feel inadequate.
Right.
And it's, like for me, I was in the sense that, you get people who don't feel they need, or don't want, for example, lower surgery, and get sent these messages that therefore they're not really a man if you haven't done that. And that's not true, of course, but also that for a lot of trans people who haven't completed their surgical route, that's because the NHS, is there's such huge waiting lists, and because actually
Mm,
some of the surgery options here, they're good, they're really good, but they're not perfect, and there are complications that can happen, and so there are people that sort of desperately want lower surgery, but can't have it for various reasons. So
mm,
I
yeah.
always think, like, when you're having these conversations, it's kind of like I want those people to feel secure, like no matter where you are in your journey, you are still valid. But also I
Mm,
understand that actually that causes a lot of pain and dysphoria because it did for me, you know?
mm,
And for me, on a personal level, I don't didn't feel my journey was complete until lower surgery. Yeah. Now
mm,
that's not the same for other people, but whenever I heard those conversations about surgery, it would make me personally feel incomplete. I was fortunate in some ways when I transitioned because the waiting lists weren't quite as long. And also, I mean, I started off going privately. So
mm,
essentially, what I did was I got a meeting with a private psychiatrist, and within a very short space of time, I had started hormones. And within a few years, and again, I really can't remember how long it was,
mm,
but within a few years, I had kind of had surgeries. Whereas now, particularly if your only option is to go the NHS route, then you are looking at a what three a 2 to 3 year waiting list just to be seen for your first
wow.
appointment, and that doesn't include then you have to have several follow-up appointments before they will even start you on hormones. So
Hmm.
years and years, sometimes generations, but well, not generations, sorry, decades before you and whatever complete means to you in terms of your surgical transition, that
Hmm.
completion happens.
Wow. Yeah. See, that's, I guess, I suppose, almost a downside of more people feeling free to or safe to come out. There's obviously more demand on that, and obviously, if they're not picking up the pace with that, then it's like a bottleneck, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's the combination of those two things. Obviously, more people, and with more visibility, that means that younger. If I had been growing up, and I've explained how I really knew my identity very young. If I had been
Hmm.
growing up today, I would have seen at least some representation of that. Mostly bad representation, particularly from the kind of factual media, which I think is pretty appalling.
Hmm.
But I would have at least seen some representation, and I would have been able to go, that's me. And I would have been able to come out very young, even younger than I did.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you've got absolutely people coming to that realization much younger, more people coming to that realization. But at the same time, society, number one, our NHS is underfunded anyway, no matter what. So, trans healthcare is really just like a microcosm of our entire healthcare system. There are long waiting lists for us. There are long waiting lists for everyone, but it's kind of put under that even firmer microscope because a lot of society doesn't really care. What we don't actually really want to know about the trauma it causes to make people wait for surgery. And it's a real, once you've made that revelation to yourself, there is this kind of, or certainly for me, this real need. I know who I am and I need the world to see who I am, and I need to be able to make these changes. And to make, for people to be waiting years and years and years and years is just cruelty. But I don't think society yet sees or wants to see that.
Mm. I mean, that's something I've spoken to with other guests about body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria. And I have heard that not everyone experiences dysphoria as such, but I guess a large amount of people do. And I think once you've decided, well, not even decided, once you've, discovered and embraced who you are, you just want to get on with it, right? You just want to get on with
Yeah,
life, living your life the
100%.
way. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Well,
Yeah.
hopefully there will be improvement on all that at some point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
at some point, yeah. I mean, yeah, there will be. I
There
think
will
we're
be.
going through this. I think this happens with civil rights movements. You get so I think I grew up in a period of when not very much by society at large was known. And yes, like, of course, like within the medical community, a lot was known about trans people, and but in the kind of like wider society, really it wasn't something people thought about or talked about that much. And in some ways that lack of visibility was quite safe. you know
Mm.
Now, what
Mm.
I think tends to happen is you get this kind of lack of visibility and this lack of understanding of the issues for a group of people, and that kind of raises, and it kind of, it starts to become into public consciousness. But as that happens, there's a lashback, or there's a backlash.
Mm-hmm.
And I think 2015 was known as the trans tipping point, wasn't it? And it was because there was being a lot more visibility of trans people in our media, particularly in our fictional media. The person that I think really emulates that for me is Laverne Cox.
Mm-hmm.
This person that was sort of like famous trans woman, actress, and also kind of, revered for her beauty, but also her beauty as a trans person, not her beauty despite the fact that she was trans.
Mm.
And that's kind of that 2015, I think, was also the year that the backlash really, really, really started. And it's been building since then, with a kind of rise in our media, just as they'd like to with every minority at some point or another, just focusing on the dangers, or the bathroom panic, and all exactly the same lies that were told about gay people in the 90s, the 80s and
Mm.
90s. And funnily enough, actually, that era, so it's that era, we're in that era now. But 2015, that was the year I decided to do my second proper coming out, I suppose, because after transitioning, I was very much of the opinion that, I will just transition and then I'll live my life pretty much stealth. Obviously, people who were in my life beforehand knew, and there were probably a good few people that thought it was a nice, juicy piece of gossip that they liked to tell other people. But as a general rule, I kind of lived stealth. But in 2015, I could see that was happening politically. I could see there's going to be this political fight, and I decided that I wanted to be on the forefront of it. Which,
Mm-hmm.
anyway, I've digressed a little bit from my main point, which is I think this always happens, and I think eventually, we are going to win, and there might be some step backs in the way to winning, which I'm slightly worried about with the things around the reform of the Gender Recognition Act and stuff like that. So society
Mm-hmm.
might take a step back or two, but 10, 15 years' time, it's going to go the way these social progresses always go, which is we'll look back at this era and we will look back in shame. And I think that will be the time that really trans medical care and particularly care for children and things like that really starts to improve properly once
Mm.
there is this general understanding that actually treating us like dirt wasn't okay.
Mm. So, for you, looking back, I mean, you said you kind of like to present as a boy, even when you were young. So you might not have a feeling of a major contrast here. But when you look back to a time before you transitioned and after, besides obviously the feeling you have in yourself and with your own identity, do you notice a big difference in how the world around you responds to you or has responded to you in the past, like before and after?
Yes and no. So, funnily enough, in terms of gender, not really. And the reason for that, I think, is because, like you said, I think, I knew my identity as a boy. So I knew that my identity was a boy, and I tried to present that as much to the world as possible when I
Hmm.
was very young. And I transitioned quite young. So I haven't really had any adult experiences of gender other than that of a man. So I can't really have much of that conversation that other people can. And I know there's some really fascinating stories that people have about how the world has perceived them pre and post transition, but it's not one that really echoes my own because of those
Hmm.
combination of things.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that I could say is that two things. One, and it is based around gender because once I had transitioned, suddenly I was more confident. I was myself.
Hmm.
And also, weirdly, with that, I was free to be feminine. So, and again, this is something I would say is a point that, again, not a universal point of transness, but certainly a conversation I've had with other trans men who have said similar, which is pre transition, your whole focus, and certainly around gender, is presenting male to the world. And when you no longer have to do that anymore, actually, that's very liberating and you can and suddenly those things that I don't want people to read female here become things that don't matter, you know.
Hmm.
And so actually that was really really liberating to be able to do that, to be able to embrace that side of myself. And I haven't done it yet, but I would really really love to do a little bit of drag. And
Hmm.
this is something that of course I would never have considered in the past. But
Hmm.
it's why, to me, all those arguments about kind of gender identity and gender expression basically being the same thing, which you get from a certain type of sort of transphobic people, oh, you're just trans because you think wearing trousers, being masculine means man. No, I don't think that. That's the
Hmm.
performance. But for me, yeah, I'd say that's the one main thing, embracing femininity and becoming more confident. And of course, that confidence means that your interaction with the world is very different to how it was before.
Hmm. That's a great point, actually. I know you're making a point of very much talking about your experience rather than, trying to be general about it, which is obviously everyone's experience is different. And that's why I always like to say, I'm not sure I've said it in the last few episodes actually, but like when I ask people how they identify, I ask them what it means to them because it is very much an individual experience, isn't it?
100%. And one of the things, like I think about when people talk about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman and everything in between is like those. So let's just take the binary for simplicity here, although I don't agree with it. For those of us that identify as either a man or a woman, I can only say, I can't say what it means to be a man. I can say what it means for me to be a man and my personal experience of that, and that is the same, and that is the same for every man on the planet. Yes, I can never know what it's like to be a cis man, but then my cis men friends don't know what it's like to be each other. So it's very individual, and I think that's one of the interesting things about being trans. And because I find it's a real one of the thing for me is that when you're trans, and particularly when you think about it a lot when you're young, you've been thinking about those concepts of gender from your earliest memories. Certainly that's the case for me. And so it's really interesting to see where those experiences unite with other people and all the similarities, but also the complete differences. And that's why it is so important that there is no universal trans experience and there is no invalid trans experience. You don't have gender dysphoria, you're still valid. You didn't feel like you were always in the wrong body, you're still valid. You don't want lower surgery, you're still valid. All these different things.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that. I think that's a beautiful way to wrap it up. Do you have anything you'd like to add before we do?
I mean, I don't know who listens to these in terms of, your audience, but I'd
Neither
imagine you
do I
get
yet.
a few trans people listening. But I suppose if anyone is listening and wondering about their gender, I think it's just too important to kind of reiterate that it doesn't, you are the best arbiter of your own experience of gender, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't fall into some box. And for me, although there have been a lot of hardships, because there may be people listening to this that are still really going through those hardships, and I certainly wish I'd never gone through those, like the mental health issues that really can go along with being trans simply because of the way society is. But for me, that it has led me to have this really unique perspective on gender and on the world, and something that I don't think many people can have. I think, and I certainly, I really am glad, and I feel fortunate to have that and to be able to hold on to that. And I think it's always good when you're feeling down about your identity and how the world sees you to kind of be able to go, okay, well, I have this kind of specialness about me, and where other people see the world in black and white, where other people see gender in black and white, I can see it in multicolor and technicolor. And I just kind of wanted to put that out there if there's anyone listening and feeling insecure about themselves.
Lovely. Technicolor. Gender and Technicolor. I love it. Oh, thank you so much for talking to me and taking the time. That's great.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Charlie, where you can also read the transcript. And you can find Charlie on Twitter at CharlieXCAINE. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com and on social media. If you like what we're doing here and you want to support us, you can do so by becoming a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded.